Picture Willowbrook Heights, where peace shatters at dawn, with chainsaws hacking Benjamin Hartwell's majestic tree, all because our HOA president, draped in a tracksuit that screams bedazzled dumpster dive, decided its leaves were a crime. She thought her snippy letters would bully Sweet Ben into packing his bags. Big mistake, Sparkly. That tree spat ignited a neighborhood brawl juicier than a soap opera cliffhanger. She didn't know she'd crossed a man with a plan fiercer than her knockoff designer glare. I'm dishing the wild details to you, dear viewers, and trust me, the twist will leave your jaw on the floor. Comment below with where you're tuning in, because this leafy fiasco is sprouting chaos she can't prune away. Grab a snack, this suburban showdown's about to make her regret ever picking up that megaphone. It all began on a crisp March morning in Willowbrook Heights, an upscale community with meticulously maintained Victorian houses where every lawn looked like it belonged in a magazine. The neighborhood had that perfect suburban charm where property values stayed high and neighbors generally minded their own business, making it ideal for families putting down roots. Benjamin Hartwell was sipping his morning coffee on the front porch, admiring the magnificent oak tree his grandparents had left him. A gorgeous giant with branches spreading wide like arms embracing the entire garden. His grandfather had told him this tree existed before the neighborhood was built, witnessing generations of families come and go. Ben had inherited this house 3 years ago, and the oak tree was practically the heartbeat of the entire property. The morning sun filtered through its leaves, creating dancing shadows across his yard, and birds nested in its sturdy branches year after year. Beautiful morning, isn't it? Ben said to himself, breathing in the fresh spring air while watching a pair of cardinals build their nest in the oak's protective canopy. But suddenly his peaceful moment was interrupted by a sharp, strident voice. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Hartwell?" He turned around to see a woman approaching, and oh boy, her outfit was truly a sight to behold. Margaret Thornfield was wearing a shocking pink vest, bright enough to blind pilots, paired with baggy yellow neon pants and cheap plastic high heels that click-clacked loudly on the concrete sidewalk. Her fake handbag covered in counterfeit designer logos swung dramatically as she walked, and her artificially blonde hair was teased so high it defied gravity. Everything about her screamed too hard to look important, from her gaudy plastic jewelry to her overly confident stride. Ben noticed she was carrying an official-looking folder. "Yes, that's me," Ben replied, not yet sensing the danger approaching. He set down his coffee cup and stood up politely, having been raised with proper manners. Maggie's fake smile vanished instantly, replaced by a scowl that could sour milk. "I'm Margaret Thornfield, president of the Willowbrook Heights HOA. We need to talk about your tree situation immediately." She pointed accusingly at the oak tree like it had personally insulted her family. "This overgrown monstrosity is blocking my morning sun completely. My property values are dropping because potential buyers can't see the full possibilities with this massive obstruction, casting shadows everywhere." Ben's jaw dropped slightly, not from shock, but from the sheer absurdity of her complaint about a tree that had been a selling point for every house in the area. "Ma'am, this tree has been here for over 100 years. It was established before these houses were built, and it's protected under city heritage guidelines." "I don't care if dinosaurs planted it personally," Maggie snapped back, her plastic jewelry jangling aggressively like wind chimes in a hurricane. The sound was almost musical in its annoyance persistence. "Rules are rules, Mr. Hartwell. Willowbrook Heights maintains certain standards, and frankly, your landscaping choices are affecting everyone's investment in this community. We can't have individual preferences undermining collective property value." Ben tried to stay diplomatic, though he could feel his patience starting to wear thin like a rope under tension. "Look, Mrs. Thornfield, I understand views are important to homeowners, but this tree has significant historical importance to our community. It's been featured in local history books and tourism guides." Maggie cut him off with a dramatic wave of her fake Louis Vuitton bag, the motion so theatrical it could have been choreographed. "Historical? It's ugly, overgrown, and definitely not compliant with current landscaping guidelines. I don't have time to debate ancient history when we have modern standards to maintain." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Maggie becoming increasingly animated and Ben growing more bewildered by her sense of entitlement. She spoke about property values, community standards, and HOA authority like she was delivering a sermon from a mount made of fake designer accessories. Ben noticed how she kept glancing at his tree with genuine hatred, as if the oak had somehow ruined her life personally. Her complaints became specific and petty. It dropped leaves in fall, birds made noise in the morning, and the shade prevented her from growing sun-loving plants. Finally, she declared that this wasn't over and stormed off in her click-clacking heels, leaving Ben standing there wondering what tornado had just blown through his peaceful morning. That afternoon, Ben found a thick envelope in his mailbox with the letterhead Willowbrook Heights HOA URG, Willowbrook Heights HOA, stamped across the top in aggressive red letters. The envelope felt unnaturally heavy, and a sinking feeling in his stomach suggested that Maggie wasn't the type of person to give up easily. Ben tore open the envelope with trembling fingers, his morning coffee growing cold as he read through what appeared to be an official violation notice, with all the professional formatting of legitimate legal documentation. Inside was a document titled Violation Notice, unauthorized landscaping structure, that looked professional enough to fool anyone at first glance, complete with fancy letterheads, official seals, and complex legal language that sounded intimidating to the average homeowner. He scanned through the pages with growing disbelief. Subject property found in violation of Section 15.3-B regarding setback requirements for organic structures exceeding 20 feet in height, established per updated HOA bylaws dated. Ben double-checked the dates and realized immediately that these supposedly established rules were dated just 6 weeks ago, conveniently shortly after Maggie had moved into the neighborhood and begun her campaign against his tree. The timing was so obvious it would have been laughable if it wasn't so infuriating and potentially costly to fight legally. "This is complete nonsense," Ben muttered, grabbing his laptop to conduct immediate research into the legitimacy of these claims before they could escalate further. He spent the entire afternoon poring over his original property deed, initial HOA documents, and city planning records with the thoroughness of a detective investigating a crime scene. His grandparents' documentation clearly showed that the oak tree was designated as a heritage landmark feature when the development was approved decades ago, with specific protections written into the original neighborhood charter. Furthermore, there was absolutely no mention of any height restrictions or setback requirements in the original HOA constitution that everyone had signed when purchasing their homes, making these new rules appear out of thin air like magic tricks. Ben's architectural training kicked in as he analyzed property law with professional expertise, and he knew suspicious documentation when he saw it, having dealt with fraudulent permits and fake certificates in his professional career. The next morning, Ben decided to confront Maggie directly, rather than let this nonsense continue to escalate through official channels that might give her fabricated rules more credibility. He found her outside her house, tending to a garden that consisted entirely of plastic flowers, arranged in geometric patterns that somehow managed to look both expensive and tasteless simultaneously. This time, she sported a sundress printed with enormous flowers in bright purple and orange that seemed to move independently in the breeze, accessorized with plastic jewelry so loud you could hear it jangling from across the street like a mobile wind chime orchestra. "Mrs. Thornfield," Ben called out politely, walking over with the papers in hand while trying to maintain diplomatic composure. "I've reviewed your violation notice carefully, and I believe there's been some kind of serious mistake. These regulations simply don't exist in our original HOA bylaws, and I have all the documentation to prove it." He kept his tone respectful despite feeling increasingly frustrated by this obvious attempt at manipulation through intimidation tactics. Maggie straightened up dramatically, placing her hands on her hips in a pose that made her look like a superhero whose superpower was being insufferably annoying to innocent neighbors trying to live peacefully. Her jewelry jangled like an alarm system as she turned to face him with the confidence of someone who believed her own fabrications. "Young man, perhaps you don't understand how HOA operations actually work in the real world of modern community management. The board has full authority to update requirements as needed to maintain community standards and protect everyone's substantial investments in this neighborhood." Her tone dripped with condescension thick enough to spread on toast, and she spoke slowly, as if Ben were a child who couldn't grasp basic concepts. "Perhaps you should educate yourself about contemporary community governance before questioning the decisions of experienced leaders who actually know what they're doing and have the community's best interests at heart." The way she spoke made it clear she considered herself some kind of neighborhood royalty, whose word was law and whose decisions were beyond question. Ben remained calm despite feeling his irritation growing like a plant in fertilizer under perfect growing conditions. "I respect the board's authority completely, Mrs. Thornfield, but major policy changes require proper member notification and voting procedures, according to our original signed agreement that's legally binding on all parties. I've checked all the records meticulously, and there are no meeting minutes, no member notifications, and no voting records for these supposed updates. You simply can't create new rules overnight and expect them to be legally binding without following established procedures. Maggie's confident expression flickered slightly like a candle in the wind, but she quickly recovered her composure with the practiced skill of someone accustomed to bullying her way through problems and intimidating people into compliance. Some matters require immediate attention for community safety and property value protection, Mr. Hartwell. Emergency protocols allow for streamlined decision-making when quick action is necessary to prevent potential disasters that could affect everyone's investments. Emergency protocols? Ben asked incredulously, his voice rising slightly, despite his efforts to stay composed and diplomatic. For a tree that's been standing here peacefully for 100 years without causing any problems? What possible emergency could justify creating fake regulations and threatening homeowners with violations? The absurdity of calling a healthy, stable tree an emergency was almost laughable, except for the serious legal implications of the fake documentation. Suddenly, a silver sedan pulled up to the curb with perfect timing that seemed almost choreographed, and a tall man in an expensive suit stepped out with the practiced confidence of someone who made a living manipulating legal documents and intimidating ordinary citizens. "Ah, perfect timing indeed," Maggie smiled smugly, looking like a cat who'd just cornered a particularly plump mouse and was prepared to toy with it before the final pounce. "Ben Hartwell, meet Gordon Wickshire, our HOA legal counsel and expert in community property law." "Gordon, Mr. Hartwell seems confused about our newly implemented landscape management regulations and the board's authority to enforce community standards for everyone's benefit." Gordon approached with a fake smile and an overly firm handshake that lasted just a bit too long, the kind of greeting designed to establish dominance and make the recipient uncomfortable. "Mr. Hartwell, I appreciate your concerns about proper procedures, and they show a commendable attention to detail, but Mrs. Thornfield is absolutely correct in her assessment. The HOA board maintains broad discretionary powers for community improvement and safety under standard association governance principles. These botanical guidelines are completely within our legal purview and are specifically designed to protect everyone's property values and maintain the neighborhood's prestigious character." Ben looked between these two people and suddenly realized he wasn't just dealing with an overzealous neighbor, but with what appeared to be an organized campaign designed to force him into compliance through intimidation and fraudulent legal documentation. The way Gordon appeared so conveniently, with prepared talking points, suggested this confrontation had been planned in advance, and Ben was beginning to understand that this battle would require more than just polite conversation and common sense to resolve successfully. That evening, Ben was still mulling over the strange coincidence of Gordon's perfectly timed arrival when he bumped into his neighbor Dorothy Finchley while collecting the mail from his curbside mailbox. Dot, as everyone in the neighborhood called her, was a sharp-eyed 70-year-old widow who missed absolutely nothing that happened in their community and possessed the memory of a steel trap when it came to unusual occurrences. She was known throughout Willowbrook Heights as the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator, someone who could tell you exactly when each household put out their garbage cans and who had visitors at what times. "Ben, honey," she said, looking troubled as she clutched her small terrier's leash with one hand and a stack of mail with the other. "I saw something rather odd last night that I think you should know about, given your current troubles with our self-appointed community dictator." Margaret and that slick lawyer of hers were at Printmax, downtown, around 9:30 in the evening, carrying boxes and looking rather furtive. Dot had lived in Willowbrook Heights for over 15 years and possessed an almost supernatural ability to be in the right place at exactly the right time to witness important events that others might miss. It struck me as highly unusual because Printmax is normally closed by 8 o'clock sharp, but the lights were still on and they seemed very determined to avoid being seen by anyone who might recognize them. Ben invited Dorothy inside for tea to discuss her observations in more detail, sensing that her keen eye for detail might have uncovered something crucial to understanding what he was really dealing with in this escalating situation. Dot settled into his comfortable kitchen chair with her terrier at her feet, and continued her account with the precision of a professional courtroom witness who had been preparing for testimony. "I was walking Buster around 9:15 when I noticed Margaret's distinctive car parked at Printmax. You know, the store downtown near the bank with that flickering neon sign that needs repair. It's certainly a strange time to be conducting urgent printing business, don't you think?" She leaned forward, conspiratorially, lowering her voice as if Maggie might be listening through the walls with some kind of surveillance equipment. Margaret was carrying a laptop computer and a large stack of papers, looking around nervously like she didn't want to be seen by anyone who might recognize her or question what she was doing there so late. That lawyer fellow was helping load multiple boxes into her car trunk, and they both seemed in quite a hurry to finish whatever they were doing and leave the area quickly. Ben felt his detective instincts tingling as he absorbed this information, realizing that late-night document production might explain the professional appearance of the violation notice he'd received. Printmax, you said. You're absolutely certain about the timing, location, and the people involved? Dot nodded vigorously, her silver curls bouncing with the motion of someone completely confident in her observations. Absolutely certain, dear. I remember because that annoying neon sign was flickering in that irritating way it does when the weather gets humid, and I thought it was particularly odd that they were still open for business so late. Plus, Margaret's never needed urgent printing services before, as far as any of us neighbors know. Why wouldn't she just use her home printer for simple HOA documents like any normal person would do? The implications of professional late-night document production at a commercial printing facility were becoming clearer by the minute, and Ben realized he needed to investigate this lead immediately before the trail went cold. The next morning, Ben drove to Printmax and struck up a friendly conversation with Tommy, the young employee behind the counter who apparently worked night shifts frequently and had seen his share of unusual customer requests over the years. Tommy had the casual demeanor of someone who'd witnessed enough weird customer behavior that nothing really surprised him anymore, from people printing fake diplomas to creating elaborate party invitations at the last minute. Yeah, I remember that lady pretty clearly, Tommy said after Ben vaguely described Maggie without mentioning her name or revealing too much about his investigation. Kind of hard to forget someone like that, you know what I mean? She was wearing some wild yellow flowery dress that looked like it belonged in a 1970s disco, and she kept asking specific questions about official-looking paper stock, like she was planning to forge government documents or something equally shady. Tommy leaned closer across the counter, lowering his voice like he was sharing state secrets with a trusted confidant. Between you and me, she paid extra cash to use our highest quality letterhead template and wanted everything designed to look super professional and legally legitimate. She seemed really stressed about getting the formatting exactly right, like someone's life depended on making these documents appear authentic to scrutinizing eyes. Did she mention what specific type of documents she was creating, or who they were intended for? Ben probed carefully, not wanting to seem too obvious about his investigation while trying to gather as much information as possible. Tommy shrugged and glanced around to make sure his manager wasn't within earshot before continuing his account. Something about HOA business and community regulations, I think she mentioned. She specifically requested formatting that would match legitimate legal documents, fancy headers with official seals, professional fonts, that whole 9 yards of making something look official. She wanted absolutely everything to make her papers look as legitimate and intimidating as possible. Even asked about special heavyweight paper that would feel more substantial in people's hands when they received these documents. This information definitely piqued Ben's interest further, as it suggested systematic premeditation rather than spontaneous rule creation or simple neighborhood disputes. The fact that Maggie had gone to such elaborate lengths to make fake documents appear authentic indicated that she knew perfectly well that her claims had no legitimate legal basis whatsoever. Armed with this smoking gun evidence of potential document fraud, Ben realized that his situation was far more serious than a simple neighbor feud over landscaping preferences or property aesthetics. He decided to contact an attorney who wasn't connected to local HOA politics and could provide objective legal advice about his options for fighting this systematic harassment. After searching online review sites and asking for recommendations from trusted friends who had dealt with property disputes, he scheduled a consultation with Patricia Morales, an environmental law specialist with a stellar reputation for fighting property rights cases against overreaching authorities and corrupt homeowners associations. During their meeting in her downtown office, lined with law books and successful case files, Patricia listened intently to Ben's story and examined the suspicious documents with the careful attention of someone who'd encountered similar fraud attempts before in her extensive career. Mr. Hartwell, Patricia said, after conducting a thorough review of all the evidence, these violation notices definitely exhibit concerning irregularities that strongly suggest potential fraud and abuse of authority. Legitimate HOA bylaw changes require specific notification periods mandated by law, formal member voting procedures with proper documentation, and official filing with county records that can be independently verified. If Mrs. Thornfield indeed created fraudulent regulations to support her personal vendetta against your heritage tree, we're looking at potential legal violations that go far beyond a simple civil matter and could result in serious criminal charges. Ben left Patricia's office feeling simultaneously relieved to have professional legal support and apprehensive about the potential scope of what they might be dealing with if Maggie was willing to forge documents. "So you think I have solid grounds to fight this harassment legally?" he asked, as Patricia walked him to the door. She nodded confidently with the assurance of someone who had won similar cases before. "Absolutely, Mr. Hartwell. Property rights protection includes safeguarding homeowners against fabricated regulations and document fraud. However, I want you to prepare yourself mentally for the possibility that people like Mrs. Thornfield rarely back down gracefully once they're confronted with evidence of their wrongdoing. This situation may escalate significantly before we can resolve it through proper legal channel." Over the next few days, Ben felt cautiously optimistic as Patricia helped him build a strong case against Maggie's fraudulent claims. He'd formally requested postponement of any tree removal requirements pending legal review and had demanded full documentation of the alleged regulatory changes through certified mail. The evidence of late-night document creation at Print Max seemed like it would be enough to expose Maggie's scheme and put an end to this harassment. Ben even started to believe that the worst might be behind him when Inspector Timothy Brennan arrived Thursday morning to assess the alleged safety hazard that Maggie had reported to the city in a desperate escalation of her campaign. Patricia was present as legal observer while Ben organized a comprehensive presentation with historical documentation proving the tree's heritage status, a structural engineer's report confirming its health and stability, and hundreds of photographs showing the robust root system and strong branch structure. Inspector Brennan spent over 2 hours examining the oak tree from every conceivable angle, taking measurements, checking soil conditions, and documenting his findings with professional thoroughness. Ben watched carefully, noting that the inspector approached his job with genuine expertise, rather than someone who would fabricate safety issues for personal gain. After completing his examination, Brennan delivered his verdict with confidence. "Mr. Hartwell, this oak tree is an exemplary specimen by any measure. The root system is completely stable, the trunk shows no signs of disease or structural weakness, and there are absolutely no indications of safety hazards. Furthermore, the heritage designation protects this tree from unnecessary removal under city ordinances, making Mrs. Thornfield's complaint baseless from both safety and legal perspectives." Ben felt like celebrating as Patricia smiled knowingly beside him. "So you'll report that the tree poses no safety hazard whatsoever?" he asked, wanting to make absolutely certain. Brennan nodded definitively without any hesitation. "Absolutely correct. In fact, removing this tree would be detrimental to the neighborhood's historical character and could potentially violate preservation guidelines. There's simply no justification for the emergency removal that Mrs. Thornfield has been demanding." Ben thanked the inspector profusely and called Dot to share the good news, who practically cheered over the phone in her enthusiasm. That evening, Ben poured himself a well-deserved glass of wine to celebrate what felt like a decisive victory, genuinely believing that the worst of this ordeal might finally be behind him. Ben was sleeping peacefully when a loud mechanical noise jolted him awake at exactly 3:07 in the morning, according to his bedside clock. Initially groggy and confused, he assumed someone was doing late-night construction work nearby, but the sound grew louder and more insistent, definitely coming from directly outside his house rather than down the street. Suddenly he recognized the unmistakable roar of a chainsaw operating at full power, which made absolutely no sense for this time of night in a residential neighborhood. Ben jumped out of bed, threw on clothes as quickly as possible, and rushed downstairs with his heart pounding from adrenaline and growing dread about what he might find outside his front door. The scene that greeted him was beyond anything his worst nightmares could have conjured. Margaret Thornfield, wearing a ridiculous purple tracksuit with glittery accents that sparkled in the street light, was operating an enormous orange chainsaw like a woman possessed by demons. She had already hacked off several major limbs from his beloved oak tree, with debris scattered across the lawn like the aftermath of a natural disaster. Ben screamed over the roar of the machinery, running barefoot across the cold grass. "What the hell are you doing to my tree?" Maggie completely ignored his desperate pleas, continuing her systematic assault on the ancient oak, with mechanical determination that suggested she'd planned this destruction down to the smallest detail. Ben ran closer, waving his arms frantically to get her attention. "Stop this right now! You have no authority to do this!" Maggie finally shut off the chainsaw, sweat dripping down her face and breathing heavily from exertion, but her eyes held a wild gleam of triumph that chilled Ben to his core. "Emergency removal procedures, Mr. Hartwell," she shouted with obvious satisfaction, gesturing dramatically at the mutilated tree, like she was presenting evidence in court. "This tree poses an imminent safety hazard that requires immediate action regardless of what time it is. The HOA board granted me special emergency authorization to protect the community." Ben looked around in absolute horror at the devastation already accomplished. The century-old tree was severely damaged, with massive limbs lying severed on the ground, sap bleeding from fresh wounds like tears of a dying giant, and the destruction extending far beyond the tree itself to his fence and garden. "You can't do this," Ben cried desperately, his voice breaking with emotion. "The inspector approved the tree just yesterday. There's no emergency." Maggie smiled wickedly as she prepared to fire up the chainsaw again, determined to finish her destructive work. "Emergency provisions supersede routine inspections, Mr. Hartwell. I have full legal authority to act when community safety is at stake." She pulled the starter cord violently, and the chainsaw roared back to life as she resumed her attack on what remained of his grandfather's tree. Ben immediately dialed 911 with shaking hands. "Emergency! Someone is destroying my property with a chainsaw. Please send police immediately." Within 10 minutes, squad cars arrived with flashing lights, creating a surreal scene in the normally quiet neighborhood, as neighbors emerged from their homes to witness the devastation that had been wrought in the darkness. The aftermath of that horrific night felt like waking up in a completely different world, where everything Ben had believed about justice and property rights had been turned upside down. Officer Martinez approached cautiously through the debris field that had once been Ben's beautiful front yard. "Sir, what seems to be the problem here?" Ben pointed with a trembling hand at the destruction surrounding them, hardly able to find words adequate to describe what had happened. "She illegally cut down my tree. This is criminal property destruction. There was no authorization for any of this." But Maggie marched over confidently with a folder retrieved from her car, producing papers with official-looking seals and fancy letterheads that she thrust toward the confused officer. "Officer, I have complete emergency authorization from the HOA board to remove this dangerous tree that was threatening community safety," she declared with the confidence of someone who believed her own lies. "Mr. Hartwell has been refusing to acknowledge legitimate safety concerns despite multiple warnings and formal notices." The police spent over an hour trying to sort through what seemed like a jurisdictional nightmare between criminal property damage and civil HOA authority disputes. Ben watched helplessly as his century-old heritage tree lay dismembered around him like the corpse of a murdered family member, feeling a personal violation deeper than any mere material loss. This tree had been where he'd climbed with his grandparents, where he'd carved his initials as a boy, where generations of birds had nested and children had played in its shade. The officers ultimately couldn't arrest anyone immediately because they needed to investigate the authenticity of Maggie's documents and determine proper legal procedures, leaving Ben feeling abandoned by the very system that was supposed to protect him from exactly this kind of destructive behavior. Dot appeared in her bathrobe, having been awakened by the commotion like most of the neighborhood, and she surveyed the devastation with tears in her eyes. "Ben, honey, I'm so sorry this happened," she said, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "That woman is absolutely criminal for doing this to you and your beautiful tree." Ben stared at what remained of his grandfather's oak, just a bare trunk standing like a gravestone monument to Maggie's destructive obsession, while trying to process the magnitude of loss he was experiencing. The property damage extended far beyond the tree itself. Broken fence sections, destroyed flower beds, deep ruts in the lawn from heavy equipment, and the complete destruction of the landscape feature that had defined his property's character for over a century. As dawn broke and the police finished filing their initial reports, Ben noticed something critical in Maggie's emergency authorization paperwork that made his pulse quicken with a mixture of rage and hope. The timestamp on the documents showed they were dated from the day before Inspector Brennan's visit, which created a logical impossibility that even the most corrupt official couldn't explain away. "Patricia," he called his attorney as soon as business hours began, his voice tight with controlled fury, "I need you to examine these emergency authorization documents immediately. Maggie just made a fatal error that proves this entire thing was premeditated fraud." When Patricia arrived and reviewed the evidence, her expression transformed from professional concern to barely contained outrage. "Mr. Hartwell, this constitutes irrefutable proof of criminal fraud. Emergency authorization can only be issued in response to confirmed safety threats, not imaginary ones that don't exist yet. Creating backdated authorization documents to justify premeditated property destruction is a serious felony, not just a civil matter. She continued examining the papers with forensic attention to detail. Furthermore, legitimate emergency procedures require witness signatures from multiple board members, but these documents show only Mrs. Thornfield's signature, making them completely invalid even if the threats had been real. Ben felt vindication and devastation warring in his chest as the legal implications became clear. "So we can prove this was planned in advance?" Patricia nodded grimly, her professional composure barely containing her anger at such blatant fraud. "Absolutely. These documents demonstrate that Mrs. Thornfield planned this destruction despite knowing the tree was completely safe. This transforms everything from a civil dispute into multiple felony charges. Premeditated property destruction with aggravating circumstances of fraud, forgery, and malicious intent. As Ben stood among the ruins of his heritage tree, he realized that Maggie's arrogance and attention to fake documentation had just provided the smoking gun that would finally bring her to justice, though it had come at the cost of something irreplaceable that could never be restored. Detective Russell Montgomery proved to be exactly the kind of professional law enforcement officer that Ben had hoped would take his case seriously, rather than dismissing it as a neighborhood squabble that wasn't worth police attention. During their interview at Ben's house 3 days after the destruction, Detective Montgomery examined the evidence with systematic thoroughness that restored some of Ben's faith in the justice system. Detective Hartwell, what initially appeared to be a single incident of property destruction has revealed a pattern of systematic fraud spanning over 2 years, the detective explained while taking detailed notes. Mrs. Thornfield's HOA activities have affected multiple property owners throughout Willowbrook Heights, and your case provided the key evidence we needed to build comprehensive charges against her. Detective Montgomery opened several evidence bags containing electronic devices seized from Maggie's house during the search warrant execution, multiple laptops, sophisticated printer equipment specifically designed for creating official-looking documents, and boxes upon boxes of forged paperwork documenting fake HOA violations against various residents. We also obtained security camera footage from Mrs. Delgado's house across the street that captured the entire midnight incident in high definition, the detective continued. The video clearly shows Mrs. Thornfield operating the chainsaw independently, systematically destroying a healthy tree without any legitimate authorization whatsoever. There was absolutely no emergency situation that justified her actions, and the footage proves she knew exactly what she was doing throughout the entire destructive process. Ben watched the security footage with a mixture of satisfaction and renewed anger, seeing Maggie's methodical destruction of his tree played out like a crime documentary. The video clearly showed her checking her watch repeatedly, suggesting the timing had been carefully planned to minimize potential witnesses. And the audio captured her shouting about emergency authorization, even while knowing her claims were completely fabricated. "Detective, she knew exactly what she was doing," Ben said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment decision. She planned every detail of this destruction." Detective Montgomery nodded in agreement, closing his notebook with the satisfaction of someone who just solved a particularly complex puzzle. "The evidence absolutely supports premeditation charges, Mr. Hartwell. The grand jury is already reviewing the case for indictment on multiple felony counts." The legal proceedings accelerated with the efficiency of a well-oiled machine once the evidence was properly presented to the authorities. District Attorney Sarah Williams explained to Ben and Patricia during their meeting that the case was receiving serious attention due to the overwhelming documentation of deliberate criminal activity across multiple victims. "Mr. Hartwell, it's rare to see a case with such comprehensive evidence of systematic fraud and destruction," Prosecutor Williams said, spreading the evidence files across her desk like a roadmap to justice. Mrs. Thornfield created a paper trail that leads directly to conviction on numerous felony charges. Between the property destruction, document forgery, embezzlement of HOA funds, and conspiracy, she's facing potentially significant prison time, along with mandatory restitution to all affected parties. The grand jury returned indictments within 1 week of reviewing the evidence. 5 counts of felony property destruction, 3 counts of fraud in the first degree, 2 counts of embezzlement, and 1 count of criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. Ben felt profound relief reading through the formal charges, finally seeing the legal system recognize the magnitude of what Maggie had done to him and other innocent residents of Willowbrook Heights. "Mr. Hartwell," Prosecutor Williams explained with professional satisfaction, Felony charges of this nature carry serious penalties, including substantial prison time and mandatory restitution that will ensure Mrs. Thornfield pays for every dollar of damage she's caused to you and the community. Simultaneously, the civil lawsuit proceeded with equal success, as property damage assessments confirmed total costs exceeding $70,000 when including the tree's historical value. Extensive landscaping destruction, foundation damage from root system disruption, reduced property values throughout the neighborhood, and compensation for psychological trauma. Expert testimony from environmental specialists established that Maggie's actions violated not only city ordinances and HOA regulations, but also state historical preservation laws protecting heritage trees over 50 years old. The HOA board, finally freed from Maggie's intimidation and manipulation, voted unanimously to remove her as president and initiated proceedings to dissolve and reorganize the association under new bylaws, specifically designed to prevent future abuses of authority by power-hungry individuals like her. Facing serious criminal charges and overwhelming evidence of guilt, Maggie attempted increasingly desperate measures to escape the consequences of her destructive actions. Security cameras captured her at 4 a.m. loading suitcases into her car in what appeared to be preparation for fleeing the jurisdiction, but alert neighbors recognized her suspicious behavior and notified the police immediately. She was arrested at Cincinnati Airport just hours before a scheduled flight to Mexico, adding attempted flight from prosecution to her growing list of legal problems. Her subsequent plea bargain attempts were repeatedly rejected by prosecutors, who recognized that allowing her to escape full consequences would only encourage similar behavior in other communities where she might relocate. The trial began on a crisp October morning, with the courtroom packed with Willowbrook Heights residents who had come to support Ben and witness justice being served to the woman who had terrorized their community for years. Prosecutor Sarah Williams delivered a compelling opening statement that laid out the systematic nature of Maggie's crimes with the precision of a surgeon. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence will clearly demonstrate that defendant Margaret Thornfield engaged in a calculated campaign of fraud, destruction, and theft, spanning multiple years and affecting numerous innocent families. Williams declared with quiet authority. The victim, Benjamin Hartwell, lost not merely a tree, but a family legacy and community landmark through the defendant's deliberate criminal actions motivated by nothing more than petty spite and a desire to control others. The defense attorney's weak strategy of claiming Maggie had acted within legitimate HOA emergency authority crumbled immediately under the weight of overwhelming evidence. The prosecution's case unfolded like a perfectly choreographed performance, with each piece of evidence building upon the previous one to create an unshakable foundation of guilt. When the security footage played in the silent courtroom, showing Maggie systematically destroying Ben's tree despite his desperate pleas for her to stop, several jurors were visibly moved by the obvious malice and premeditation displayed in every frame. The audio was particularly damaging, capturing her lies about emergency authorization while she continued her destructive assault on a tree that multiple experts had declared completely healthy and safe. Key witnesses provided devastating testimony that demolished any possibility of reasonable doubt about Maggie's criminal intentions. Tommy from PrintMax explained the unusual late-night document production session with embarrassing detail about Maggie's specific requests for official-looking formatting and materials. Dot described her observations of suspicious activities leading up to the destruction with the precision of a trained investigator. Expert witnesses confirmed that the oak tree posed no safety hazard whatsoever, eliminating any possible justification for emergency action. Detective Montgomery presented forensic evidence proving systematic document forgery and embezzlement of HOA funds, painting a picture of someone who had made fraud and manipulation into a personal art form. Ben's testimony proved particularly powerful, as he calmly recounted the events leading up to that horrible night. His obvious emotional pain balanced by clear-headed factual presentation that left no doubt about the impact of Maggie's crimes. When the defense tried to portray him as an unreasonable neighbor who refused to compromise, their strategy backfired spectacularly against the mountain of evidence proving Maggie had fabricated every single justification for her action. Ben's dignity throughout the ordeal, combined with his thorough documentation of events and willingness to follow proper legal procedures, made him a sympathetic and credible witness that the jury clearly believed and respected. During cross-examination, the prosecution delivered their most devastating blow when they introduced evidence that had been discovered during the investigation but held back for maximum impact. Mrs. Thornfield, Prosecutor Williams said with calm authority, Our forensic accountants have discovered that the community funds you embezzled far exceeded our initial estimates. Bank records show you diverted over $30,000 from HOA accounts to support your personal legal fees, document creation expenses, and even the purchase of the chainsaw used to destroy Mr. Hartwell's tree. Maggie's composure completely cracked under this revelation, her confident facade crumbling as she frantically tried to deny the financial evidence while simultaneously attempting to blame others for her criminal actions. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Maggie's breakdown continued on the witness stand, her attempts at explanation becoming increasingly contradictory and desperate. She tried to claim that Gordon Wickshire had misled her about legal procedures, that the HOA members had pressured her into taking dramatic action, and that she had somehow been protecting the community's interest by destroying Ben's tree. However, bank records and canceled checks clearly showed her direct authorization of fraudulent transactions, and recorded phone conversations revealed her plotting the destruction with careful premeditation. Additional federal charges were filed simultaneously during the trial for mail fraud and wire fraud, as investigators discovered that Maggie's criminal activities extended to other jurisdictions where she had previously lived. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all criminal charges: felony property destruction, fraud in the first degree, forgery, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. The civil case resolved favorably with a substantial damage award that included not only actual costs but punitive damages, reflecting the malicious nature of Maggie's destruction. During the sentencing phase, Judge Patricia Hendricks delivered comments that perfectly captured the community's sense of justice being served. The defendant's actions represent a serious abuse of institutional authority and a fundamental betrayal of community trust. The systematic nature of these crimes and their impact on innocent families requires a substantial deterrent sentence to prevent similar criminal behavior in the future. Maggie received 3 years in prison plus 5 years of supervised probation, with court-ordered full restitution, including tree replacement value, property repairs, legal fees, and punitive damages totaling over $90,000. Ben felt profound closure watching Maggie led away in handcuffs, finally facing the consequences of her systematic victimization of countless neighbors who had suffered under her authoritarian reign of terror. The community celebrated not just the conviction, but the restoration of peace and civility to Willowbrook Heights after years of living under Maggie's oppressive and destructive influence. Ben used a significant portion of his settlement to create a memorial garden where his grandfather's oak tree had stood, transforming a site of destruction into something beautiful that would benefit the entire community for generations to come. The project became a neighborhood effort, with residents contributing labor, local nurseries donating plants, and environmental groups providing expertise to design a sustainable landscape featuring multiple heritage species representing diverse ecosystems. The garden dedication ceremony represented the triumph of community spirit over individual malice, with hundreds of people attending to celebrate not just Ben's victory, but the restoration of their neighborhood's character and values. During the ceremony, Ben planted a new oak sapling in the center of the memorial garden, knowing that future generations would enjoy its shade just as he had experienced with his grandfather's tree. As he patted soil around the young tree's roots, he reflected on how Maggie's attempt to destroy his family legacy had instead created something even more meaningful: a united community committed to protecting each other and the environmental treasures entrusted to their care. The memorial garden flourished beyond all expectations, becoming a gathering place for community events and educational programs about historical preservation and environmental stewardship. Ben's experience transformed him into an advocate for HOA reform legislation, working with state representatives to strengthen protections against fraudulent authority abuse by power-hungry individuals who view community leadership as an opportunity for personal revenge rather than genuine service. His story inspired similar victims across the nation to seek justice against corrupt homeowners association leaders, and he maintained regular correspondence with people facing HOA abuse throughout the country. Professional opportunities grew unexpectedly as media attention led to numerous landscaping and heritage tree preservation projects, with Ben's reputation as an expert in historical property restoration expanding throughout the region. The memorial garden became a living testament to the power of resilience and community solidarity in the face of destructive behavior. Children played under the growing saplings, families gathered for picnics among the flowering plants, and neighbors found peace in the beauty that had grown from such devastating destruction. Ben often sat on the bench dedicated to his grandparents' memory, watching the oak sapling grow stronger each year and knowing that Maggie's attempt to destroy his heritage had instead created a legacy that would benefit the community for decades to come. Sometimes, he would tell visitors to the garden, the most beautiful growth comes from the deepest wounds. She thought destroying my tree would eliminate my family's legacy, but instead she planted seeds of justice and community that will flourish long after her crimes are forgotten.
QA stories where reality feels like fiction and fiction wishes it was this juicy. Hit that like before the next bombshell drops.